find out what else is grabbing headlines around the world, Solange Mougin is with us for it. Solange, you're starting off with this very particular Monday for French students. We mentioned it in the news bulletin.
Yeah, it won't be your average Monday for many students today as they head back to the classroom after the fall break. Now, the nation's on lockdown, but schools are open this time. And as West France, the local French paper, explains that nationwide, children in primary schools, so that's 6 years and up, must now wear masks in the classroom. And as Le Figaro tells us, this Monday morning will also be different because across the nation, teachers will pay tribute to Samuel Paty, the fellow teacher who was killed by a jihadist just before the fall holiday. Now, there will be a minute of silence as well as discussions. And this means for Libération that France's teachers are currently, quote unquote, on the front lines. Not only are they trudging through the sort of complex waters of having to teach subjects like blasphemy and like secularism, but they're also on the front lines because of exposure to the coronavirus. And many of them, the paper says, feel that they have been abandoned by the government.
Solange, teachers aren't the only ones that are saying that they've been abandoned by the government, are they?
No, this sort of sentiment of being left to fend for yourself or for themselves is also being felt by shopkeepers, according to L'Union. The French paper explains that small shop owners have managed to get the government to close down big supermarkets' non-essential aisles, such as books and clothing departments. But as Les Echos tells us, the anger among those whose businesses have been shut for the entirety of the lockdown is still very vivid. They say the closures, we mentioned this earlier in the business section, that this gives unfair advantage to certain multinationals and sites like Amazon. And this growing anger over the lockdown is putting the government in a bind, according to L'Opinion. The paper says Emmanuel Macron is being tossed around between two wars, one against terrorism and jihadists, and the other against the coronavirus. And we can see that in the cartoon by CAC that has the countries is at level 5 of not Vigipirate, which is the name of the anti-terrorist plan in French, but Viropirate.
Perhaps it'll catch on, that phrase. Let's turn now to a plea to end violence and intimidation. Today is the United Nations International Day to end impunity for crimes against journalists.
Yeah, and the Daily Star, the Bangladeshi paper, goes into very real examples of journalists who are being persecuted. It profiles some of them, and it writes 38 of them were arrested in Bangladesh this year under a digital law that the editor calls, quote, the playthings of those who want to prevent journalists from exposing corruption and misuse of government funds, end quote. And it's not just intimidation. The paper and the United Nations says that worldwide, the number of journalists that are killed is increasing. And to call attention to their and to our plight, the Hong Kong Free Press is covering the work of some 80 women in a report called Faces of Free Speech. And it's a way to remind the world that we aren't alone, be it journalists or anyone else, in trying to seek the ability to speak our minds.
Nicely put. Let's go to that story then, which we may mention once or twice this week. Many Americans gearing up to speak their minds at the ballot box in the US presidential election. The American press is saying there's much fear in the air.
Yeah, the New York Times has an interesting article today about fear in America, that Americans are more scared of the future of their country than they are of their personal circumstances. They're more scared of the state of their democracy than getting the coronavirus, for example. And it's felt by both Republicans and Democrats, according to the New York Times. Now, this fear for American democracy is perhaps jacked up even further by another article in the Times from this weekend entitled The Day After Election Day. And this article is not about the ballot boxes and who will win, but about potential violence from Trump fans. Several officials pointed out to the investigative journalist, quote, that Trump has an army of ardent followers that are loyal to him as a person and not as a president. That army, Trump may activate it, he may bargain with it, depending on how the election chips fall. It is his insurance policy, end quote. And you could even potentially say that army may have already been activated to a certain degree if you look at things like the Trump train or Trump supporters attempting to push a Biden bus off the road in Texas this past Friday.
Yeah, scary stuff. I mean, Solange, looking at the American press, would you say that it seems to be fearing or that it's likely that there could be violence?
Well, according to the Intercept, the investigative site, there is a possibility that such violence could occur. They found that private security firms have been recruiting former special ops members to, quote, protect election polls and businesses from looting, end quote. Now, does this mean that such firms are going to intimidate voters or create violence to benefit Trump? Not necessarily. But one voter rights advocate put it this way, quote, the idea that people may be out there recruiting personnel trained in warfare and be in a vigilante fashion, patrolling our citizens on our own streets in the U.S. is very alarming, end quote. So there's definitely fears about who will win, but there's also fear about the potential that the U.S. could become quite violent.
Fingers crossed that will not be the case, of course. Finally, from Solange, she's found an article about a couple of con men.
Yes. Some relatively potentially successful ones, even though they got caught. They must have been very good at their trade because
Yes.
they swindled nearly 80,000 euros out of a doctor by selling him Aladdin's magic lamp.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
The doctor believed the men, and he paid the first installment of 7 million rupees. This was in India, before figuring out that the alleged genie that had previously come out of the lamp was, in fact, the con man's accomplice.
Funnily enough, dressed up
Yes.
in a puff of smoke. I've got Superman's cape under here. It can help you fly. Would you like it, Solange?
We'll join a team. We'll become con men ourselves.
I think we'd have him. I think we'd have him. Not a very clever doctor, we suspect. Solange Muget with the papers. Thanks very much.